Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity, for the great honor to be able to speak here today. I'm very happy the presents were given out before the speeches were given for two reasons. First, because in audiences like this, I'm not sure who knows more about the directives. Parts of the audience are myself, because some of you have been working, some of you have been writing the directives. So there is a bit of an issue there. And secondly, because probably our perspective of the directives is different from a research perspective on the directives, different from a regulatory perspective on the directives, and perhaps also different from an approach of people who have to implement then afterwards on the ground many elements of what we are regulating. So the idea status of the directives, I try to translate a little bit in trying to run through main features, at least for me, for the Nuclear Safety Directive and for the basic safety standards and radiation protection, but really try to stop at points where we sort of feel that, let's say, in many dimensions, work may still be needed, and work also from the community represented in the two conferences here may still be needed. So it is obvious that we're talking just about a part of what Euratom regulates, but we're talking about a very important part, and in the case of radiation protection, about one of the founding areas, really, of the Euratom Treaty. But if you look at the developments of the legal framework at EU level, it is also clear that there was quite a massive development of the legal framework since 2009, and clearly since Fukushima, then shortly afterwards. You see in short succession the first directive on nuclear safety adopted after a long discussion, a long fight, legal proceedings around whether there is a role of Euratom in this field or not. The waste directive then, the smaller directive, the specific directive on drinking water, and then the revised basic safety standards directive and the amended nuclear safety directive, and I'll come back to these two, which are my task to present today during the course of the presentation. So on nuclear safety, really the link to the Fukushima accident is quite important. And when the European Council met shortly after Fukushima, looking at the impact and the response to be given at EU level, it gave two tasks, really, two mandates. It gave a mandate to look very quickly through the system of stress tests at the situation of nuclear power plants and installations in operation in the European Union. And it gave the mandate to review the legal and regulatory framework for nuclear safety. And that's quite significant because obviously the directive, the new Nuclear Safety Directive adopted in 2009, 2 years later, the European Council says, you may want to go back and review, and you will find that the amendment of the Nuclear Safety Directive as a result has actually strengthened the directive compared to the original directive in important instances. And that's quite important at the stage today when we look at how member states have actually transposed, how have member states actually put this particular piece of law into their legal framework. So the stress tests took place. Action plans were developed. There's regular reporting on the action plans. Some of it is not completed yet, but a great lot of it is completed. The Nuclear Safety Directive then, in its amendment, and probably in the middle of the Nuclear Safety Directive, the idea of continuous improvement of nuclear safety. And the slide shows, and I will, as I say, in the short time here, go very, very quickly to an audience which is, of course, aware that the introduction of the safety objective clearly was an innovation of the new directive, the idea of the peer reviews, different kinds of peer reviews, but also the topical peer reviews, stress test-like reviews which were introduced into the directive, the notion of nuclear safety culture, provisions on emergency preparedness and response, which were new here and link up to provisions on the BSS, to which we come back later, and of course the notion of the independence of the regulatory authority and the ideas of transparency which were strengthened by this directive. Now, this is it. Perhaps someone can just change the slides, that would be very kind. Okay, thank you. So the nuclear safety objective, as I say, as this sort of notion in the middle of this new piece of law, which looks at this sort of continuous process of improvement, which goes through all the different stages of the development of the plant, from the design to decommissioning, the idea of preventing accidents, the idea of mitigating the consequences of accidents, and the idea of this staged approach, where we look in different ways at existing and at new installations, but also for the existing installations, the expectation that there is the continuous improvement of safety towards the best possible achievable situation. Now, again, different elements as provided for the safety objectives. And as you can imagine, I mean, jumping to what is probably more interesting for you when we now look at the transposition of the directive in the member states, you know, the directive is due to be transposed. The member states have by and large declared transposition to varying degrees. So we're now looking very closely at what is happening. It is clear that behind a lot of these concepts which we saw on the previous slides, the role and the independence of the regulator, the implementation of the safety objective, the exact provisions around the assessments and peer reviews, the provisions around transparency, we are looking very closely at what is going on, and we have to obviously legally operationalize some of these concepts which are fairly general in the text of the directive. But it's not all theory. We have already launched through NSREC the first of the topical peer reviews. Topical peer reviews take place every 6 years. This first one was dealing with aging, and you will probably be aware that the reports was published just last October, and national implementation reports are now due to be developed, which will be followed up in a similar way as the stress test reports will be followed up. It's important to draw lessons, of course, from a first application of the peer review, and this is something which will be done in time for the next peer review to start. But it's also very clear that the process of transparent follow-up of the different findings of the peer reviews of what are the commitments in the action plan will be very important. Now, sometimes it changes, sometimes it doesn't. And if you look at some of the findings and challenges, which show that there are quite significant differences in the national approaches, even though all member states, I'm sorry for turning around, it's the only way to see the slides and the audience at the same time, all the member states have aging management plans in place, but we see a lot of difference. We see a particular issue around some of the older research reactors. In some countries, we have seen in the report challenges on the evaluation of the programs, but clearly the international peer reviews, the link to the IRS and to Artemis then from the waste side are seen as a good practice. And as I said, it's now the time to present the national reports. So the Nuclear Safety Directive, a very political directive, strengthened, and a directive where we are now in the middle of the checks in member states, our legal responsibility as the Commission as far as the transposition into national laws and regulations are concerned. I cannot give you the outcome of that process, but I can tell you that it's a very thorough and intensive process with the authorities of the member states looking very deeply into the functioning of the systems. We're looking not just at laws, we're looking at implementing regulations, at guidelines, at practices. We are getting citizens writing in, speaking about nuclear safety, and we use that information as part of the discussion. So it's a very intensive process where we're in the middle of at the moment. So on radiation protection, as I say, a very old competence, so we're talking about something different here. I mean, the legal challenge of the new BSS, on the one hand, is that obviously a lot of what is in the directive is not new in radiation protection, but it has all been put into one document, into one common framework, which is good because it gives one legal place where radiation protection provisions are being put together, and it is difficult at the same time because if you then give this directive and you say to member states, this is the new directive, please implement, please transpose it, it sort of looks like a huge and a very, very big task ahead of everybody. So the 2013 revision, apart from putting everything together and in this way trying to facilitate the application of radiation protection at EU level, and you see the different provisions set out at the bottom of the slides, or you don't see them, but I think the slides are available, was also to look at the development of science since 1996. So the safety standards directives come in a bit of a 10-15 year rhythm. It covers now all radiation sources. We wanted to cover natural radiation, and there are provisions on radon, covers all exposure situations, and it integrates, as I said, the different dimensions, workers, members of the public, patients, or the medical area into one legal framework. So I want to highlight really a couple of areas out of the BSS because we think that these are areas where there is probably also quite a bit of research interest in taking work forward. And one of these obviously is the medical field. This is not the first time we're regulating medical exposures. I mean, there has been a specific directive for medical exposures which has been in place, and a lot of the provisions in the BSS actually are provisions which have been taken from that previous directive. But there have been a few important changes, and there is clearly also now with the new directive and with more attention on radiation protection, a very important need to bring together the health and the radiation protection dimensions in the application of the directive. What I mean is that when you speak about the protection of workers, probably about the general public in many areas, there's the one radiation protection authority in the country which is charged, which is able to issue specific provisions for the country, even in the cases of particular incidents. The medical field is different. It's a different world. And medical applications are being done, as you know, for the good of a patient, if all goes well. And it's a different mindset. And at the same time, the directive this is just to show the variety of application of radiation in medicine, as well as the importance of medical applications for public exposure. But this variety of application is just an indication of what I was talking about. But if you look at the main changes of the BSS in the medical field, particularly linked to changes in the justification and optimization of medical practices, this by the health sector is seen as a new dimension of the development of guidelines, of the dimension of clinical care, of patient safety. And an important task we are having for the moment at our level is to bring these discussions together, because there's a discussion about evidence medicine, obviously, about guidelines, about appropriate treatment in health, and we have a discussion on optimized and justified treatment with radiation. So it's important to bring these discussions together, and there may actually be, even from the angle of the radiation protection research, an interest to reach out to health research to bring some of this a bit closer together. In order to facilitate that process, some of you may have heard this acronym of SAMIRA, the Strategic Agenda of Medical, Industrial and Research Applications of Radiation and Nuclear Technologies. And our idea with the SAMIRA process. We had a couple of conferences, we had a number of studies, we spoke to stakeholders, is to look towards the new mandate of the Commission at an agenda of issues which are areas where the European Union could add value to perhaps on the one hand to promote some of the non-power applications, but also to do that in full recognition of radiation protection and other safety requirements. And I think that echoes well with what we heard in the opening session from many speakers who talked about non-power as an emerging area of activity. The Council is preparing conclusions, so we get member states hopefully to back the idea to work in this area, and it is looking like that this agenda would have a very big M in it, in the sense that there seems to be a particularly important need to look at the medical field here again, to bring together the pharmaceuticals work, the medical devices world, and the radiation protection world. So we hope that in terms of securing radioisotope supply, radiation protection and safety for medical staff and patients, innovation and human resources and capacity building, we can perhaps add a bit of value in the future. The other area where we have been adding provisions in the BSS is natural radiation sources, and in particular the requirements to establish national radon action plans in the member states. Now, obviously, they will look different depending on the exposure situation, but it's also clearly one of those areas where radiation comes literally very close to people and literally very close to their interest. And it is an area where I think where member states, beyond transposing the law, can learn from each other and can develop, and research can help develop approaches, particularly about communicating risk, but also about mitigating risk in terms of some of the well-established good practice, particularly for older buildings and older sites. And then emergency preparedness and response. Now, I've left that for this directive because it's more legal presentation here, and the strengthened provisions are largely in the new Basic Safety Standards Directive. But few people are perhaps aware that the directive contains very specific provisions obliging member states not just to develop emergency plans, be prepared, and so on, but also do this in a way that there is close cooperation internationally. And what we mean by internationally is not just internationally, but a very, very close link of emergency plans regionally, across borders, and between member states. And this is an important area. This is an important and very strong provision of the directive, which is something we will, with the member states, have to look at as a priority area when we look at the transposition of the BSS directive, which is a little bit behind the Nuclear Safety Directive simply because it came into force a bit later. But when we look at the provisions of the Basic Safety Standards Directive, I think it is very clear that the implementation of the requirements in emergency preparedness and response will be a central part of what we will be looking at. So there's more in the slides. Needless to say that there is a role of the European Union more directly in this. We, of course, have provisions in place as part of the Euratom legal framework to organize early warning and communication between member states. We are monitoring radioactivity, and the systems like EURADWASTE come into place into an emergency mode when something happens. But also we have legal provisions in place to regulate radioactivity in food and feed following accidents, be it outside the European Union or inside the European Union. We can pursue this if you're interested, but I think it's important as part of the overall framework. So what we would say, and we would say that, but I think it's clearly an achievement over the last 10 years that the Euratom legal framework has provided framework has provided ourselves with possibilities to really look at ensuring a high level of radiation protection, nuclear safety across the European Union. As I said, member states are different, they're taking different approaches, and it's important that the different approaches at the same time still lead to this high level of safety standards, which is so important in the acceptance of the technologies, which has been discussed also over the morning. Both of the big directives, but also the waste directive, which will be presented afterwards, represent significant changes in this legal framework. And so the process of bringing this into member state law, their directives, so they have to be transposed, is a process which, while it should have been finalized, it's now entering its final phase, and we have conformity checks underway, as it is called, transposition checks, which should help us to understand how member states are doing. If things are not doing well, we will have to take member states to courts, but that's perhaps not the main purpose. But the purpose is to identify areas where, by working together also, we can help member states in taking these provisions forward. Our provisions, as far as we can see them, and certainly the provisions of the BSS, which come so much out of the development of science, are dependent really on research outcomes. So when the organizers felt it was useful to have a presentation on the directives to kick off this part of the conference, I would say from our perspective, it's equally important for us to hear about the development of science, to understand how the development of science would have to influence the legal framework. So I'll leave it at that. I realize I was very superficial. I went very, very fast, but I did go through, what, Massimo, 400 pages, I think, of printed official journal of the European Union. And if I had read that out, it would have been much worse. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy, together with colleagues, to address them.
Thank you very much. You have a gift, Mr. Mikhail.